You're listening to the Penteract Poetry Podcast, hosted by Anthony Etherin.
Okay then, so the purpose of this podcast is to look at what it is to be an artist, what the point is in being an artist. What is the point? What is the point? Is it pointless? And I think we could break that down into two. One is what is the point for the individual? What are they trying to get from it? And then also, what is the point culturally? How does it benefit society? So I suppose it's probably easier to start with the first. What's the point in being an artist from the point of view of the artist?
I think there's a category of person that is creative and that needs to do something that exercises their creative faculties. And if they don't do that, it destroys them. I think that's true. And I've worked with lots of creative people in my practice as a teacher and a mentor to many young artists. And I found that to be the case. You can't tell creative people not to go out and explore and do these things. You simply can't. It would destroy a huge part of them not to do it. So I would say that succumbing to that compulsion is like a necessary form of self-preservation for those sorts of people. And if they don't have an outlet, it not only makes them miserable, but it's likely to make their family miserable too. And then society won't get the benefits of their inventiveness. So that just seems like a lose-lose all around. There's a distinction to be made between having a practice as an artist and making a living at it. Sometimes those two things overlap, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to get onto later. I'm glad you used the word compulsion there, because that's something I've written down in my notes. It is a compulsion. That's certainly true, that you can't help be an artist if you're just wired that way. I'm glad you think that it's a healthy thing. It might not be. It certainly feels like an addiction sometimes.
I think it would have to take the form of a compulsion in order to do it with the necessary consistency, because it's a difficult thing to do in many respects. It doesn't slot neatly into any area of society. The role of the artist in society is an extremely ambiguous one. This has been observed many times. We have a kind of peculiar relationship to class because artists sort of belong to every class of society simultaneously. And we can sort of float or navigate between those different layers in a way that a lot of other people can't really do. And I've often found that in my own life. So because you can plausibly fit in anywhere, in a certain sense, you don't really belong anywhere either. So the artist has a strange condition in that sense. You can have people who in their private lives are completely down and out and disenfranchised, and yet who get the attention of the elite, who might be courted by the elite, who might be, because there's a difference between social status per se and cultural capital, let's say, the perceived value of your work within society.
Yeah, the artist is in themselves, that the artist is not highbrow or lowbrow, they're no-brow.
Yes, that's right. I've had wildly contrasting experiences in my life as far as that goes. I found myself in the absolute highest possible echelons of society, and I found myself in, I wouldn't say the lowest, because the lows are pretty low, but I've been in some pretty dicey situations. So I've seen a range of things, and a lot of artists can plausibly fit into any of those. Some better than others, of course.
Do you care to divulge some examples on either end of that scale, or is it all top secret?
I don't know if it's top secret. Let's start with the higher end because that's maybe more fun. I've often had occasion to meet with ambassadors, members of royal families, politicians, people who work in cultural ministries, things like this, as well as very well-known artists in many different countries. So it's odd in that sense, because you find yourself in these black tie events from time to time, or red carpet events, or whatever you want to call them. And there's a contrast between that and your actual living circumstances. Mine aren't bad by any means, and they're improving, incidentally, on a fairly regular basis, which is nice. But there have been times that have been extremely difficult. And so to shuttle between those two relative extremes.
Yeah, you don't own a palace yet.
I don't own a palace yet. No, yet is the crucial word, of course.
I won't ask you about the low.
It's probably not a good idea to get into that right now. Maybe if this conversation goes on long enough, we'll get into it.
Well, I was a punk rocker, as you know, so I played some questionable establishments. So, okay, well, we're already talking about society then, and the role of art in society. In its broadest sense, what is the role of art? What does it achieve, really? What does it contribute to the human experience? Big question, sorry.
I'm tempted to say it depends somewhat on the society. I think there are societies in which it takes a very central role, and societies in which its role is more ambiguous and hard to define. Ideally, I would say that it's something that puts us into contact with things that are transcendental, or at the very least, if you don't want to use metaphysical language, that are larger than our everyday concerns. And I think that's an extremely valuable function. We need to be reminded consistently of the fact that there is more to reality than the tiny bit of it that we interact with on a daily basis. We're not wired for that psychologically. We're in fact wired, the way our perception is set up is that it's a gigantic filter, right? So that it cuts out most of the things that our perception decides are not relevant or useful for the task at hand. We simply ignore these things and we don't notice them. So what we think of as being reality is an infinitesimally tiny slice of what actually is there. So what the artist can do, of course, is to vastly enlarge that space and put us into contact with all sorts of things, a potentially unlimited number of things. So that has great value for the individual, I think. It has an ennobling quality, I believe, and it also has an exalting quality. On a societal level, it can bring people together in ways that few other things can. It doesn't always do that, but it does have that ability. And when it really does it, it's absolutely remarkable. To give an example that comes immediately to mind, have a look at gamelan music from Bali. It's absolutely extraordinary. We have no equivalent to that in Western culture, really. But there are these ensembles of percussion instruments, and this is a very old tradition that they have. And they play with such exquisite precision, with rhythms that you can't notate. These are really subtle and complex rhythmic patterns. You can't write them down. And they can play them with just such extraordinary verve and precision. And, the orchestra might have 20 or 30 people in it, and they're playing together like I wouldn't say like a machine, but like a super entity of some kind, where their individuality is completely lost within this group collective activity. That seems like an intrinsically valuable thing to pursue in a society. Western symphonic orchestras are another example of that. If you want to play some of the bigger Mahler symphonies, you need several hundred people. So you've got several hundred people, several hundred apes, basically sitting on a stage in ties and suits, playing these difficult instruments, playing a composition by an Austrian who died 110 years ago, when they could be out, killing each other for scraps of food. And we're not doing that. We're doing this collective activity instead. And I find that absolutely remarkable.
Yeah, the sense of communion, which you even get with if you're just playing in a band with 2 or 3 people. It's a strange bonding experience in a way. And then, of course, you extend that to the audience. When the audience joins in, which I don't think they do at the symphony that much, but at the rock concert, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's the most profound feeling of communion you can have outside of, let's say, a marriage or perhaps a religious institution for those who are affiliated with such things. It's an extremely powerful thing, yeah, and I don't think anything can really replace it.
I don't know if you've heard the one of the recent podcasts that we did, a STEM poetry podcast. Have you caught up with that yet?
I haven't heard that one yet. No, I just saw it the other day on Twitter, but I haven't heard it yet.
Well, Pedro Puigdemont was one of the guests, and he talked about a theory that a neurologist whose name I can't remember came up with about the role of dreams. And so, according to this theory, that dreams are there to add variations on reality and some noise, essentially, to our understanding of reality, in order to help us generalize, to stop what's called overfitting when it comes to drawing patterns from reality. And Pedro speculated that that's what art serves on a cultural level. It gives us reality slant. So it gives us something that resembles reality, but which isn't. And that helps us form generalizations, more accurate generalizations of our real experiences. Which is, I think, an interesting idea, because that seems to hint at the fact that the best art is something that resembles reality, but clearly is not reality.
I would take a slightly different view to that. I would say that the best art, or at least the most profound artistic or aesthetic experiences I've had, are super real experiences, in the sense that they're more real than real. So a really profound painting or a piece of music or a film or whatever it might be is an encapsulation of thousands of layers of potential experience into something very small. Untold levels collapsed into a very small space. It would be as though you were to abstract out the most valuable features of a particular idea in a way that could never happen in reality, quote unquote reality.
Yeah. Well, I think this is working in the same area. It's stuff that operates between reality and non-reality.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. I think in music, something I've become really attentive to in recent years, more so than before, I think, is the presence of what I might think of as musical archetypes or musical patterns or ways of structuring a musical discourse that are outside of time. They're not culturally dependent, they're not historically dependent. They're things that function in music from 800 years ago just as well as they might function in a pop song that was written yesterday. And I'm noticing more and more things of this sort, and which has led me to meditate more on some of what the functions of music might be and how they interact with our consciousness and why those things are valuable.
Well, music's particularly interesting with its use of time as its main dimension, and how music, in a very tangible way, it affects your perception of time.
Yeah, I would say it's a question of movement. And of course, you can't have movement without time, really. So, but what music allows you to do is to have purposefully directed movement in a totally abstract space. It's not actual movement, It could metaphorically be movement, or you could dance to it, but it's a kind of super movement in a strange sense. And so you can set up these complex trajectories of movement within a piece of music And you can experience those vicariously as a listener. Directed movement that has a motivation behind it of some kind. And you can do that in ways that are phenomenally complex in music. And that seems to have something fundamental to do with the way we're set up psychologically somehow. We need motivation. We need to have some idea of what to move towards. And we need a sense of, well, we obviously need a sense of movement and some sense of motivation in our lives.
Resolution too. Resolution is a big part of music, and obviously, you can see a psychological reason why that's appealing.
Well, one of the fundamental polarities of music is consonance and dissonance. That can be present in many different forms, incidentally. But what that polarity fundamentally has to do with is stasis versus movement. Something that is dissonant is something that wants to move. It represents an instability. So all of these forces are present in this strangely archetypal, unconscious manner in music. And you can exist within this strange, abstract space. It's a very hard thing to talk about in many respects, I think. Because it's literally made of air.
Yeah.
Of course, it's also not made of air. It's made of what happens in our consciousness when we interact with it. It's also immaterial, but it's a peculiar art form.
The balance of repetition and variation is fascinating to me. And what Pedro was saying in that other podcast, it reminded me of it. This balance between the familiar reality and the unfamiliar, this sort of dream art world. Art seems to operate by hooking us in with repetition and then developing us through variation.
What often happens in music is you have a pleasurable tension between the setting up, the establishment of a pattern of some kind, and then the disruption of that pattern. So you need something that is sufficiently predictable so that the piece has an identity, so that it is able to relay sense or meaning to you. If the level of predictability in the piece is zero, and it makes no difference what comes next or what came before, and you can't relate one moment of the piece to any other moment in the piece, then it's extremely hard to extract any sense of meaning out of that. So establishing some kind of a pattern, and of course the patterns can be all sorts of things. They don't have to be simple iterative patterns necessarily. And then finding ways to disrupt that pattern, to move it somewhere else, or whatever it might be. That seems to be intrinsically satisfying.
Yeah, so I like the fact you mentioned the role of the mind in this. I don't know if you know this, but there's a book called Art and Visual Perception by Rudolf Arnheim, where he describes how we appreciate paintings by looking at the perceptual forces that go on within them. And it's all about the balancing of weight. So if we see blue and white somewhere, that feels light to us. If we see red, sort of earthy colors, red and brown, they feel heavy. And you can nicely balance a painting by using these things. But of course, you could also put a pile of bricks in the corner of a painting and it will feel heavy. But someone who doesn't know what a brick is won't feel the same weight. And so with this, going back to this idea of the balance of repetition and variation, somebody with a good musical ear, an experienced musician, will perhaps pick up on motifs more readily. So they won't need as much repetition in order to be drawn into the work.
I would take some degree of exception to that. I think that what a lot of professionals can do more easily than, let's say, the average listener, to the extent that there is such a thing as the average listener, is they're able to put a word to things. They're able to label them and describe them more precisely. I wouldn't say that it then follows that the layperson doesn't have those things affect them, that they don't filter into their consciousness at all. But it does make a difference when you can label something. To give you an example, I teach music analysis, so this is part of what I do to make my living. So when you teach music analysis, you explain what all the components of a piece of music are and how they relate to each other. You explain how the form works, how the different motifs that go into the piece are put together, how they're developed, et cetera, et cetera. And you have a word for all sorts of things that I suppose a non-technical listener wouldn't have words for.
Yeah, I mean, there is a risk of sounding snobbish about this and saying, "Oh, some people just don't get it because they don't have enough knowledge," and you've nicely sidestepped that. But, but there is still the issue that the more experience you have of something, the better able you are to latch onto it.
Absolutely, you can make finer grained distinctions. That's fairly straightforward. Just as a wine expert can try 10 different Bordeaux's and know exactly where they're from, what vineyard and what vintage and so on. I can't do that at all. I have no difference. I can't. If you did a blind test on me, I would probably have difficulty telling a red from a white. It's that bad. So it's
You need to drink more.
Yeah, clearly. So yes, that has a lot to do with it. You can make much finer distinctions between things. But I think that non-specialists can learn to do that also. And sometimes they can do it better than an expert, as quote unquote expert, because they might have fewer prejudices going into it. The problem with a lot of professional musicians is they've already sort of sorted out what they like and don't like. You know.
Yeah. Well, this is true. This is just as I talked about the positive of having learned more about your specific art form. Lots of negatives will come with that. You can learn bad habits. I mean, so do you think that is a real problem in the music world? There are people who have learned bad habits and are stubbornly sticking to them.
Yeah, I think the danger can perhaps lie in one thing that I've often noticed working with students, which is that if you're starting out as a composer now, in the present historic moment, there's a great challenge involved in that, which is that there is no common language, really. There is and there isn't. There are common tools and there are common ways of patterning pieces and making meaning through music, of course. But from a stylistic standpoint, the range of possibilities is extremely vast. It's much, much wider than it would have been 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago for that matter. That's a difficult thing to come into because you don't know how to orient yourself. You don't necessarily know what sort of music you should be writing when there are 10,000 possibilities. If you belong to a painter's guild in 16th century Flanders, that problem was basically solved for you because there was a limited number of motifs that you would be allowed to paint. So that's a difficult thing. So I think the temptation there is to artificially narrow down the options by means of artistic ideologies. That's something that young people will tend to do instinctively anyway, right? When you're young, you can be very sectarian. You can say, well, this band is, these guys are geniuses and every other band is complete shit, It's like young people do that all the time. That's part of how you create an identity for yourself.
And the thing that uses a synthesizer is crap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So
me.
Yeah. So, and you can be really snobbish about that. And I mean, that's just part of being young. But there's a danger there. So on the one hand, you have total eclecticism, the possibility of doing literally almost anything in the musical realm. And then that's like, how do you build from that? You can't build on limitless possibility. You have to reduce it somehow. If you reduce it too much, and if you become too blind, and you become too attached to an artistic ideology that says if you just do this, everything will be fine, then that's not very good either, because the ideology does the thinking for you, and in a certain sense, it does the art for you too, because you already know what you're trying to do, you know what you want the outcome to be, and so you just sit down and do it, and that's not very interesting either. So I think that's a very, very difficult spectrum to navigate for younger artists, and some people never get out of it. I've seen that happen. You know, they settle upon something extremely narrow and specific, uh, and and they just sort of keep going with that. Now that can also be a good thing, right? So I have to play the devil's advocate here, because there are also artists who have tried to see how deep they can go in a very narrow, specific direction. And sometimes the results of that sort of inquiry can be amazing. And I think if that comes out of a spirit of genuine inquiry, then that can take you into some very enriching places. If it's a question of ideology, though, then you're probably not that committed to the process of exploration anyway, because you already have a sense of what it is you're looking for.
Yeah, that's true. And again, that works both sides. If you're an artist who's obsessed with the idea that anything goes, you will let yourself make anything, and it will probably be a mess. So you see that just as much as you see people obsessing over what they hold to be some sort of absolute standards.
Yeah, the anything goes thing is kind of funny because, well, what if you applied that to different areas of your life? What if you applied the anything goes philosophy to your finances, or to your personal life, or to your lodgings, or to, you know, your personal hygiene? It's like you get on that train and see where it takes you. And it's the same in art. There's no difference there.
It is the same, yeah, because we make compromises in our general lives. We say, okay, we have our vices. I know I do. So we allow ourselves certain
Speak for
things.
yourself.
Yeah. You don't have any vices. Yeah, we say, well, I'll do this, but I have to do this as well. I'm going to drink a few glasses of wine tonight, but I'm going to get on that treadmill and run 5K tomorrow morning. It's like that. You can't just be completely everything goes, and you can't be completely regimented. And
No, you need a productive tension between those two things in order to generate anything. It's the same in music.
I think really that's perhaps one of the things being an artist is. It's finding where to lie between those two extremes, and for each piece as well, for each poem or each piece of music, you find out where it lies between those extremes. For some, it might be further one side, and for some, it might be further the other way.
That's it, yeah. And a lot of these things are context dependent. And one of the interesting things I think about art generally is that the artist can actually create a world that has its own properties, you know, and then the person who's perceiving the art or who's engaging with it has to accept those conditions, those new planetary conditions, you know. It's like, well, this is how this planet is set up. And you just have to accept it. And really powerful art sets up those expectations or that context instantly. You're just thrown into this world in a very powerful way. And it takes you along, and it establishes its own logic and its own in its own context internally. So some of these things can be outsourced to wider cultural tropes that exist in the world. That's what pop songs do. And sometimes it can't be outsourced, and you have to locate the premises of the work within the work itself. That would be a more hermetic sort of tradition. I mean, in my experience, people can take quite a lot more unfamiliarity and ambiguity than they necessarily think they can. It's just that we don't get exposed to very much of it. That's not all of it, because it's also true that there are lots of people that are relatively low in openness as a character trait, and who are just not psychologically predisposed to be interested in exploratory mediums. That's not their thing. But I think there's a very large category of people out there who are open or relatively open, and who have the potential to be very interested in all kinds of supposedly challenging artistic experiences, but don't do it because it's not part of their milieu. Their friends aren't engaging with it. It's not written about in the papers, you know. So
Yeah. Well, I see this a lot in poetry, especially poetry in the UK, where often quite well-educated people have an extremely narrow view of what poetry can be.
I would
I've
say
talked on the podcast before. It's a
especially
bit better in your native land.
well, especially well-educated people, I would say. There tends to be more prejudice there than amongst non-specialists. In my native land, yeah. I was extremely fortunate to grow up in Canada in the 1990s because it was an amazing place for literary innovation at that time. Absolutely amazing. I think it's since dissipated somewhat. This is what I've heard from people who are still there. But at that time, almost any night of the week in Toronto, you could go out and hear a really impressive reading. And there was a very energetic community of experimental writers that I had the good fortune to have fallen into.
Did you find the same with music, though?
Absolutely not. No,
That's
that's why.
interesting.
Well, that's why I decided to move to Europe. Actually, I couldn't find anything equivalent to that in the musical world at that time. Which is not to say that it didn't exist, but if it did exist, it was in a form that I couldn't really interact with. So that was extremely frustrating. I couldn't quite understand why the writers were so intent on risk-taking and exploration, whereas the musicians seemed, on the whole, to be extremely conservative in contrast. When I go back to visit, I have the impression that things have opened up somewhat, but it's still a very different sort of context than the one I'm in currently. So I live right on the border between France and Germany. I live very close to Switzerland also. And there's this sort of intersection of all these different cultures and languages in a very small geographic area that is extremely fertile, I think, at least for me. And then the fact also that you have all of this fascinating history in this area. It gives a particular charge to daily life, let's put it that way, that I really resonate with. But then lots of Europeans pine for Canada. You know, there's a lot of French people who wish they could live there because of the unspoilt nature and the relative openness of people there, the friendliness, and the sense of possibility. Whereas things are a lot more regimented here in France. So I'm able to see the positive sides of both parts of the world.
You seem to like living on the border. I also live on the border with Wales, and I read something a few years ago, and I don't know how prevalent this is in the dark arts, which I'm not an expert on, but I heard that occultists talk about borderlands as special places, and they revere bridges as symbols to other worlds. And I mean, that's kind of similar to what we were talking about with the art world and the real world being these separate realities. So maybe artists are drawn to borderlands.
This is an energy zone where I live. It's remarkable. And yes, I am drawn to borders. It's hard to put it into words exactly, but this particular area I live in is very geographically and culturally ambiguous for all sorts of reasons. It's been part of Germany, it's been part of France, it's been in independent territory, it's been all sorts of things. And it's been handed back and forth between these different empires for centuries. And so when I cross the Rhine to go over to Germany, which I do nearly every day, you know, that never becomes a banal thing. I've done it hundreds of times, but every single time, it's a question of going into another world. There's something magical about that. And you just all you do is you just cross this bridge, and people speak a different language, and they think differently, and they dress differently, and the culture's different, the bread's different, the coffee's different, everything's different. and it's just right there. I mean, it's a kilometer from where I live. But in my mind, I'm unable to imagine these places as being coterminous in any way. I can't imagine that they lie next to each other. It's as though you have to step into a teleporter device. You know what I mean? It's like some magical process has to occur in order for you to go from here to there. In my mind, I can't imagine them being tied together by a straight line, even though there's a road that connects them.
Yeah. Well, this is that occult thing of interfaces. I mean, I guess you could think about someone like Robert Johnson and the Crossroads. It just always comes into occult mythologies. The imagery of a crossroads or the imagery of bridges.
There are multiple bridges crossing the Rhine close to where I live, and they take on an almost magical resonance. It's palpable. You know, you can feel it in the air, the moment where you pass from one country to the next. And that's something that also affects me a lot. I mean, I'm instinctively drawn to really small countries also. I'm fascinated by them. I'm always reading about them. I can't stop myself. And European microstates and things like this. Because it's often made me reflect on what are the limits of a state? How small can you go and still have a distinct sense of nationhood? Still have a distinct sense of place? A sense of being within a country? You can go pretty small and it still works, partly because the nation is an imaginary realm. It has a geographical, territorial reality, but it's also a mental projection. It's also a mental space you can live within. So it can transcend its borders in that sense. But even so, there's that moment that, you know.
I see your point, but have you been to Vatican City?
I haven't been to Vatican City.
I've been there. That feels very much like Rome still. I think that's too small.
Well, some historians and political scientists would argue that it doesn't really fulfill the criteria of a state. I mean, Vatican City is really a special case. But I spent a lot of time in Monaco. I spent a lot of time in Liechtenstein also, which are both very, very small countries. And before I had visited, I thought, come on, this is ridiculous. How can you have a country that small? Does it actually feel distinct from the surrounding areas? And I can say that it is very distinct. It is very distinct. And it's for a lot of reasons. There's a question of family also, because the people that live together in a specific area for a certain amount of time end up having a sense of collective familial belonging. And that's a palpable thing, especially when it's bounded in by a concept of a nation state. But then there are also quirks of local culture, history, dialects, ways of doing things that create a very strong sense of place when you know the place well. Of course, if you just go in for a few hours on a lark like that, then you won't have a very profound experience, and you'll just think it's the same as everything else. When you actually spend time in a place and get to know the people who live there, then you start to understand what is really distinctive about these small countries. So instinctively, I'm drawn to those places, and there has to be a link to the way that I think about my own work and the sorts of things that I value in art as well. And what you're describing there, this concept of, well, you can say it better than I can, but an almost occult relationship to these things is something I can understand instinctively.
There's also this, perhaps there's something in the perfectionism, sort of crystalline aspect that everything, you can see it all in your mind, a smaller nation.
Yes, absolutely. And also the fact that you have to have all of the infrastructure and all of the institutions that you need to have a functioning state, right? So you have to have a center of government, you have to have schools, you have to have hospitals, you have to have a postal system, you probably need some form of defense, you need a police force, et cetera, et cetera. You know, all of the things that any country needs to have in order to function. Monaco has 2 square kilometers of territory, and they have all of those things. It's really fascinating to me.
I guess there's something like a simple computer game or the cartoons you watch as a child where you have 10 or 15 characters and they're all in the town and yet they all serve all the necessary functions of that town.
That's
Maybe there's
right.
something in that. It calls back to that simplistic view we all want the world to be like.
Well, I won't spend forever on this topic because I can get a little bit funny about these things, but I've heard that in the princely palace in Monaco, they have a three-dimensional, extremely detailed replica of the territory. And this is constantly updated, of course, when there are new building projects or infrastructure projects. If you want to build something in Monaco, every single parcel of land is claimed, right? There's no unbuilt space anywhere. So you have to figure out where you can fit things. And I just love the idea of a three-dimensional model of an entire country, having to pore over it to figure out where are we going to fit the post office or whatever it might be. That's not
amazing.
It's not the sort of problem we have in Canada.
No.
10 million square kilometers. That's the other extreme.
Hey, well, that could be a reason as well. That could be why you're obsessed with these places, coming from a country that size.
It could be.
Anyway, we should return to the topic. I'll check my notes because that was just the introductory bit, talking about the point of being an artist. Because the main thing is how to be an artist, how to carry on when you're potentially faced with small rewards or no rewards, as is quite often the case, or even losses, even constant losses.
Mm.
And it's a tricky thing to do. It takes a lot of perseverance to carry on with all the setbacks you find.
Yeah, you have to have a combination of traits in order to get through it. I think being stubborn, perhaps to the point of excess, is necessary. I think that somewhere in your psychology, you have to believe very deeply that you are able to do it. I think if you're plagued with self-doubt and you're beset with all of the typical obstacles, or more than the typical number of obstacles that invariably plague artists, then it would be extremely difficult to keep going. I think you need a support network of some kind. I think that's really indispensable. You can really get into trouble without that as an artist. And that can take all kinds of different forms. It could be a small circle of close friends with whom you share your work and they share their work with you. A simple form of camaraderie like that can be tremendously sustaining and enriching. It could be, being in a place of learning, developing a community that way at a university or at an art school, or by taking a course somewhere, whatever it might be, at a high school even. But I think having some kind of notion of community, even if it's a very nebulous one, can really sustain people. Going it alone as an artist is extraordinarily painful and difficult. And I don't think it really is sustainable in the long term.
It doesn't work. It doesn't help your mental health, but it also doesn't help you get anywhere.
I think there's a seductive idea that you somehow can go it alone. Maybe when if you were a teenager or in your 20s, you could imagine that more easily, because you're not confronted with many of the difficulties of life at that point. There are certain responsibilities that you just don't have yet. So it's easier to imagine thinking, for example, I'm just going to do my work on my own, and maybe I'll be poor, and maybe I'll exist on the margins of society, but who cares, because I've got my freedom. And I suppose there's a certain trade-off in that, but the problem is it doesn't last for very long. That picture starts to look very different when you're in your 30s, when you're in your 40s, when you're in your 50s, and you're still living in a studio apartment. So it's better to build something that can really sustain you, and to start on that early if possible.
Yeah, and art feeds back into itself. So you need, and once you realize that, you need to you need people to champion your work, and in turn, you need to champion the work of other people.
Yeah, I think that if you engage with your culture and with your community in a way that is beneficial not only to you, but also to the people around you, then you have a much, much, much higher likelihood of being able to continue doing it. I think you have to view it as a practice, as something that fits into your daily life in a kind of routine way. Not routine in the sense of dull and unconscious and automatic, but routine in the sense that there's a place for it, in the same sense that there's a place for your desk, there's a place for your bed in the bedroom, there's a place for it. And you make sure that that place is open and available on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, otherwise it's a hobby. It's something you just pick up when you feel like it or when you feel the need to do it.
That's it. Yeah, it has to do with commitment fundamentally. You have to be committed to it in the sense that you're going to do it in some manner or another every day, forever. So, and it takes a while, I think, to develop the sense of focus and concentration and the fortitude necessary to sustain a practice like that. It doesn't necessarily happen overnight. With some people it does. You get some people that, even when they're very young, they just have that sense of obligation or devotion towards what they're doing. Some people it takes longer.
And what other tricks are there for people listening? You mentioned commitment and planning, and implied you've got to work hard. But these are things everyone knows, whether they want to hear it or not. Everybody kind of knows these things. Is there any more practical advice that you could give to people?
Well, here's a negative warning. Don't use people. Make sure that your interactions with other people are not grossly transactional, take a genuine interest in what other people are doing. If you don't have genuine interest in what other people are doing, fake it until it becomes real, which it will, unless there's something deeply wrong with you, which I suppose is the case with some artists. But anyway, having a genuine sense of interest in other people, and I think trying to set projects up so that everyone involved is engaged and has a sense that they're contributing something to it and that you're not merely using them. I think that's really important. Other tips, consistency is so important. For me, that's number one. I can't take someone very seriously if I don't get the sense that they're sitting down and doing the work every day. I think
Put it another way, you can't take someone seriously if you're not seeing that they're taking themselves seriously.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can really dabble in art. You can't be a dabbler. You can't be someone who kind of just does it for fun when it's easy. You can do that, but it's just not going to go very far. So I think you need to be able to sustain that somehow. And I say that being fully conscious of the fact that some people have extremely difficult circumstances and it's not easy. I know that. There might even be people for whom it's simply impossible by dint of where they happen to have been born or their economic circumstances or whatever it might be. I recognize that. But I think that to the extent that you're able, in whatever way that might be, even if it's a mental practice, you have to find a way to sustain it.
Yeah, I could use myself as an example here for what you're saying about dabbling and being committed. Because as you know, I've been complaining to you for the last few years that I don't get enough time to work on music because of all the press and poetry commitments. I could find time here and there to do it. I could dabble, but it's unappealing. So when I work on music, I have to be all in. I have to spend just 2 or 3 days straight doing it because it just doesn't work otherwise. It's no good. It's better if I'm completely focused.
Well, let's imagine a scenario here, and I'd be curious to know what you think. Imagine that you're somebody who has to work 16 hours a day, at something menial, and you get home and you're exhausted. Maybe you're a creative person. How are you going to do anything in those circumstances? And it's no good hearing me say, well, in order to be an artist, you have to have a daily practice. It's like, and I sometimes get emails from people who are in those sorts of situations, incidentally, who are really creative people, but they're in a milieu that just makes it extremely difficult for them. So I don't mean to.
It's awful because there isn't a solution to that.
Yeah, I oscillate between not wanting to be too fatalistic, between wanting to be optimistic in the sense that, well, maybe there's a way out, but also I don't want to belittle the challenges.
We don't want to tell someone to quit their job.
Well,
you'll make millions from your art.
Yeah, no, you can't. Well, of course, you can't tell people that. It would be really irresponsible. The devil's in the details of everybody's specific circumstances, of course. I mean, again, we have to stress the fact that there's a distinction between having a sustainable artistic practice and being a professional artist. It's not the same thing. Those two things can overlap, but they don't always overlap. There are plenty of significant, wonderful, profound, important artists who never had professional careers. Where the artistic activity took place after work, when they were able to, or maybe only in a relatively short span of their life. That certainly has happened.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I mean, I hope there'll be people listening to this who take something from that.
Well, the idea is a lot of people will say, I want to be an artist. And I think they kind of, in their minds, they conflate being an artist with making a living at art. It's actually two different things. So, okay, great. You want to be an artist. Well, sit down for 6 hours a day for 20 years and write or paint or whatever you want to do. You'll unquestionably be an artist. Maybe you won't be a very good one. Maybe you'll be an excellent one. I have no idea. It's a separate problem from how do you monetize it. And not everybody needs or wants to monetize their artistic practice. I think some degree of external resonance is probably necessary in order to have the focus and the drive to keep on doing it. There are isolated examples here and there of people who really did not have a community around them, who are totally isolated people, and managed to keep on doing it. That's extremely rare. It's vanishingly rare, and nobody should imagine that that's going to happen to them, because it probably won't. The Joseph Cornell type. Joseph Cornell lived with his mother his entire life and made these boxes, these sculptural boxes that he didn't really show anybody. I don't think anyone was really aware of them until he was at the end of his life. I could have that story slightly wrong, but he was totally isolated. But you don't want to be Joseph Cornell. That's not. I don't think that's a life that you would necessarily want to lead.
Again, we're finding the balance between extremes here. You don't want to be that, but you don't want to be someone who will do anything just to chase fame and fortune and make any art that they think people will like.
Yeah, it's a very personal thing. It's going to depend on your own capacities as a person, your interests, your psychological makeup, and your circumstances. It's a blend of all of those things. There are people who have been independently wealthy, who have not needed to work, who have managed to pursue artistic projects without any thought as to whether they would be able to earn anything from them. They've simply pursued it because it's something they wanted to do. There are all sorts of possible scenarios. An example in music history, an obvious one, is Charles Ives, the American composer who was an insurance executive. He made a lot of money in business. And then he would go home at night and write ridiculously brilliant, exploratory, avant-garde music without any thought really to its performance. And he ended up being one of the most significant figures in American music. But to come back to what I was saying earlier, I think that some degree of resonance, of getting the work out into the world, is probably necessary for most people. That can take different forms.
Well, yeah, so let's assume we're talking to musicians and poets and artists who have a good, sensible balance here, and they want to try to make a small living out of it. Not not the palaces that you go to, but they want some sort of they want to get by. So what advice is there here? I mean, and one thing that you just reminded me of is that there's certainly a problem in poetry and certain fields of poetry where the audience for a poet is generally just other poets, and that's who buys their books. It's other poets, and it's quite difficult for people to branch out beyond that and get the general public out there interested in what they're doing, especially if it's very niche and very experimental.
Yeah, there's a contradiction there. You're talking about niche and experimental and the general public. There is no general public for poetry. There's no general public for any of the things I do. The general public is a 19th century concept. The idea that you would have some kind of a cohesive bourgeois class that, as a group, would be interested in things like going to the opera and the symphony, and there are still vestigial remains of that in our time, but as a whole, that category has really splintered, I think, into a large number of micro audiences.
Okay, well, let me just replace the term general public with non-poets.
Okay. That's a good start. Well, I think you have to start with your close inner circle. You have to have a close inner circle, but that can be very small. It can be your brother. It can be your wife or your husband. It can be your mother. It can be your cousin. Start with a few people like that. Maybe other writers, maybe other musicians. Maybe you have a circle of 10 people at first. If you've got 10 people willing to look at what you're doing as you're starting out, that's really good. You're doing well. And most of those people are going to be people that you already know, and or people that are engaged in the same sorts of pursuits you are. That's just how it goes. So that would be the first circle of people. The trick is to get into the second circle, which are people who might be more like acquaintances, who might have some of the same interests as you, but don't know you personally. And then the third circle are people that aren't involved in your world at all, don't know you, don't necessarily know any people you know, who might be very remote from you geographically, and trying to reach those sorts of people. So you start with a very small nucleus and you try to expand outward, and that's a gradual process. It doesn't happen overnight. It sometimes happens overnight. It happened overnight for Sam Smith. It happens overnight for some entertainers, but you probably don't want it to happen overnight because it's actually not good for you most of the time when that happens. And you have to accept that it's a gradual process. What you need are enough readers or listeners or people engaging with your work so that you can keep on doing it. And that number is different for everybody. For some people, if you're a poet, maybe you'd be satisfied if you had 50 readers. I think that's probably the case for a lot of poets. They probably have 50 readers. And maybe 50 readers is enough to keep on being a poet. And if you happen to get more than 50, then that's great. But if you don't, you can still keep on doing it. If you have less than that, maybe it doesn't work.
Yeah, well, I like the idea that we each have our own points where we say, okay, that's enough. I've got enough of an audience now. I can carry on. But isn't there part of all of us that would get to that point and then say, okay, how much more can I get? How much further can I go?
It depends on how you're wired in terms of ambition. Ambition isn't something that you can decide to have. You have it or you don't have it. And there is a certain type of person, I think, that always wants to go farther, go higher, go deeper, whatever it is, and is never satisfied. And I think there are other people where they can just reach a certain level that is satisfactory to them and just keep coasting. So it depends on the person. And it also depends on how much pain you're willing to subject yourself to. Because in some artistic pursuits, the level of pain is extremely high, and you have to be able to endure that over long periods of time in order to achieve your goals. And the problem is, of course, once you achieve your goals, you immediately seek out even more difficult goals that are even more painful. There are people that are just hardwired for that sort of thing. We know a few of them, don't we?
Yeah, I've got a bit of that in me. So here's a question going back to what we said before about the problem of working in a field like poetry or certain areas of music where your audience, you notice that your audience is other poets or other musicians. I'm interested to know which you prefer, the responses of musicians or the responses of non-musicians to your work, which is more interesting to you? Which do you covet more?
That's a great question. I mean, in my life, there are 4 or 5 musicians whose opinion I would care to know. Which I don't mean that in a snobbish way, incidentally. I just mean there are a few people that whose opinion I really trust, whose perspective I would seek out, and who I would really listen to very carefully with respect to, say, a new work of mine. Other professional musicians, the thing is, if you go to one of those concerts where it's mainly other musicians or poetry readings where it's mainly other poets, not to be cynical about this, but I would be willing to bet that most of the other people are there to be part of a scene. They're not necessarily engaging all that deeply with the work of the other artists. You know, we've probably all had this experience of going to a poetry reading, an open mic night, and everyone's kind of fidgety because the person before them is going on for too long and they just want to get up and have their 15 minutes on the stage, you know? And lots of concerts are like that too. You know, with composers, you're condemned to, unless you write evening filling works that are over an hour long, you're condemned to sharing the program with other composers. So we've all had the experience of squirming through somebody else's piece and waiting for the moment of glory when, you know, when they finally get off the stage and it's your turn. And I'm caricaturizing it somewhat, of course, but there's a bit of that to that. So no, audiences consisting of other musicians don't interest me very much for that reason. I'm much more curious about and much more often surprised by the reactions of people who wandered in or who aren't at all part of that world or, you know, found it by accident. I've had wonderful conversations with people who have ended up at my concerts that way, you know, or someone, you know, a friend of theirs recommended that they go to it. They never heard anything like it. Those are precious, valuable experiences. And those are the sorts of things I try to multiply.
And I guess the responses you get from other musicians will be quite predictable, whereas you can get all sorts of things from. I don't like using the term lay people. It seems too condescending, but you know what I mean.
Well, people without a vested professional interest,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, that's the key thing for me, I think. You know, people who are totally independent in that sense. They don't stand to gain anything from being there, or from having this or that opinion, or from being seen next to this or that person. They're there for the experience. And again, I'm in a fortunate position in the sense that I'm able to interact with large numbers of people who are not professional musicians. And that is by far the most fulfilling thing for me.
So you do genuinely care about making connections with lay people. Horrible term. Because there is a perception with things like contemporary experimental music and certainly in a lot of poetry too, there's this perception that it's all very insular and it doesn't really care about the outside world. And, you know, the words pretentious, elitist get thrown around.
Yeah, well, they get thrown around for a reason because it's actually true most of the time.
So certainly with poetry, yeah. And I'm not surprised if you say the same about music.
I think that's about what you would expect because whenever you get these small social milieus, there's a feeling of of being in with a particular group, and those things are more exclusionary than inclusive by definition. So, and that sort of thing self-perpetuates also. So if you get 50 or 100 people who are accustomed to running into each other at concerts, and they have this, a similar cultural background or interests, they kind of speak the same language, and they know the scene really well, then they're going to have a very particular view of things that someone who's just entering that space for the first time, has never encountered it before, is absolutely not going to have. One thing that I know from having spoken with a lot of people is a lot of people feel uncomfortable going into a situation like that for fear of appearing ridiculous. That they're going to be the only idiot at the back of the room who has no idea what's going on. Everybody else is shaking hands and having a great time and getting all the jokes, and understanding all of the sly references. And they're just sitting there, clutching their program, feeling completely confused and lost and not having a very good time at all. It's a caricature, but it's also a fear that a lot of people have. I know this because they tell it to me. So,
and what do you say to them?
oh, well, first of all, I understand it. I understand it completely. I've been in that situation myself when I was starting out. And I also say that one of the things that I try to do in everything I do, whether it's my work or the podcasts I do or my YouTube channel or anything I write or anything I say in public, I try to keep it as open as I possibly can without betraying the nature of my ideas. Never condescend to people, never distort your ideas so that you think that they will reach more people. Say what it is you have to say, but do so in the most powerful and direct way you can.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think that's what I'm trying to do a lot of the time, because I'm aware of what I do being perceived as a bit cryptic. Well, it is cryptic a lot of the time. So I do like to let people know what's going on. For example, I want people to know what I'm doing. So I try to make at least what I'm attempting as clear as possible. It's just trying to make it as palatable for people as possible without compromising the vision.
It can be unpalatable too, but there might be reasons why you would want to do that. You mentioned punk earlier. I don't think punk music is palatable exactly. But I think one thing that's important to bear in mind is that art can have multiple different levels to it of accessibility or inaccessibility, and those can be contained within one and the same work. So, for instance, you can imagine an artwork that on the level of the immediate encounter has a certain accessibility or seductive quality to it. So that even if you have no idea what's going on, you have no idea, you don't speak the language, you don't know what the artist is trying to do, you don't know what the meaning might be of the work in question, it's just completely alien to you. But even on the level of the first encounter, there's something there that's intriguing enough on a, I don't know, textural level, on a sonic level, on a visual level, whatever it might be, so that at least they can engage with the surface in a way that is enjoyable to them. So I think that's important. That's something you have to bear in mind. The work has to have those features to it. I think if it's only going to reveal anything to you once you've engaged with it for 3 months and you've pried apart all of its layers and that's setting the bar too high. It just means that nobody's going to interact with it. I think of this often in relation to Finnegan's Wake, which is one of the most esoteric books ever written. I believe it was George Bernard Shaw who, I probably got that wrong. I think it was Shaw who wrote to Joyce at an early stage and said, with some disdain, you're leaving aside the common man in this book. You're writing a book that nobody can understand, and you're betraying your readership. Because the book is so extraordinarily difficult to read. But even in Finnegan's Wake, there's something about just reading a page of that is so captivating and bizarre that it draws you in, even if you don't end up finishing the book.
And it's intriguing for so many different reasons and so many ineffable reasons. We've gone round to what you talked about at the start. There are people from all levels of society who will both love and hate that book. So it's far from left behind the common man.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, that book is an indelible part of uh, our collective consciousness now. Certainly, the Irish are deeply proud of it, but not only the Irish, right? I mean, it's read all over the world. Not everybody understands it. Not everybody finishes it. Lots of people own a copy of it and never get past the first page. But it's there. It's like this permanent thing daring you to pick it open and read it. So even in supposedly difficult esoteric projects like that, there's a level of fascination that can happen. Even if you never get beyond 0.1%, you never get beyond scratching the surface of what's in that book. So you have to attend to those things. In contrast, there are lots of extremely esoteric books that are absolutely no fun to read whatsoever, you know, or either because they're badly written or it's awkward or the musicality of the work is not there and it's just a slog. It's just painful.
Well, you can also get to, and again, another thing we talked about earlier, there'll be lots of people out there who just want to make a noise for the sake of making a noise, just make a mess for the sake of making a mess. And that's clearly not what Joyce was doing.
No, absolutely not. No, he had a very profound intent in that book, actually. So I think you need to attend to that. You need to bear in mind the importance of the immediate encounter and the surface quality of what you're doing. And there's nothing, this is going to sound funny in the context of that discussion, but there's nothing superficial about that. It's actually a necessary function. And you need to tie that together with the more abstract or the more difficult to apprehend aspects of the work somehow so that they form a unit. So works like that are immensely powerful and seductive because there's something that draws you in for the average listener or for the person who is not a specialist. They can get something out of it. And then, but there's also something for the specialist. And there's also something for the person who listens to it 100 times. And they can keep finding something new in it because there's enough depth there to reward that kind of attention. That, for me, is something worth aiming for, you know? So neither just writing pleasantries or things that you can understand in 10 seconds, which is like a kind of disposable art, you know? It's like you get the idea in 5 seconds and then you move on to something else. And maybe it's temporarily a bit fun and a bit stimulating, but that's about it. I'm not very interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the theme of this podcast, isn't it? That finding that balance between the tangible, nice, perhaps too banal, too simple, and the crazy, too messy nonsense. We should wind up soon. I just want to check if I've missed anything important because I have a few notes. Oh, I wanted to talk to you about writer's block. I think we kind of touched on this when you were talking about routine. Do you believe writer's block is actually a thing at all?
It's a thing in a certain sense, but it's also the problem with writer's block is it's not very well named. I think when you say writer's block, people have this image of somebody tearing their hair out because they don't have any ideas and they're overwhelmed by the blank page, you know. I don't think that's what it is. I think what writer's block actually is for people who suffer from it or claim to suffer from it is simply fear. It's just the fear of doing something bad. It's the fear of writing a bad book, the fear of writing a bad poem, and they get paralyzed by that. But the good news is there's a way around that. There are plenty of ways around it, actually. It's very important, I think, in your daily practice as an artist, no matter what it is you're doing, to ritualistically lower the bar for yourself so that you you clear your mind of any pretensions as to the quality of what you're going to do. In other words, you allow yourself to sit down and produce junk intentionally, ritualistically, in order to dispel that feeling of not wanting to put a markdown on the page unless it's perfect, unless it's profound, unless it's important, not wanting to disappoint yourself. So a method that I often describe to students I'm working with, and I get them to do this also, is you, for 2 or 3 weeks, you sit down and you have a routine where for 15 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever it is, you sit at your desk and you write, and whatever you produce in that amount of time, the deal is you have to throw it out. You can't keep it. And you have to do it for a few weeks. And you mustn't break the deal.
And then you rummage through the bins afterwards.
Well,
steal the work.
Right, exactly, yeah. That's it. The point being that when you explicitly make that pact with yourself, then there's no expectation of quality at all. You realize that you're going to throw out everything you're making, which doesn't mean that it's futile. All it means is that you're training yourself to get into a particular frame of mind at a certain time of day, every day for 3 weeks, and to focus on the process and not on the results of the process. Because you've agreed with yourself that the results of the process are going to be discarded no matter what. So it foregrounds the process. And that's a really powerful thing. And what invariably happens, I don't think I've encountered a single exception to this with any of the students I've worked with, is they do this for a few weeks, and then they start coming up with ideas that they fall in love with. And that's an amazing thing when that happens. And it's because they've lowered the bar to a point where it doesn't matter. All they're doing is setting up a regular routine, a regular practice. And that's when amazing things can start to happen, I think. You have to train for it.
So it's just subtly changing your approach to creating something. And another way to do that is purely to create something different. Variety is very important, I think. To use a really simple example, if I'm struggling to write a palindrome, I can scrap it and I'll write an anagram. It's good to have a variety of tools because they're not all going to work for you at the same time.
Yes, I think a big mistake that it's very easy to make is to seek freedom as an artist. Do not seek freedom. Seek constraint. Constraint is a fruitful thing. It paradoxically liberates you because it dramatically narrows down the range of problems that you're going to have to cope with when you're working. And that is a tremendous gift for artists. And the more severe the constraint, the more free you get. Right? So if you work with no constraints whatsoever, if anything goes, to use your phrase, then the range of potential problems that you're going to be dealing with as you do your work is also unlimited. So, and you can't do anything if you're trying to solve 300 problems at the same time. So what you want to do is to self-impose constraints. And what the Oulipo, what they revealed is that the constraints can be arbitrary and they can even be absurd. It doesn't matter, but you just need something that provides that focus.
And it could be something as loose as genre, just deciding what genre you're working on. And again, with writer's block, if you're failing to write something in one genre, there are plenty of others to choose from. So just try something else.
That's right. Well, if you want to write an actual romance novel, then that closes a lot of doors. There's a lot of things you can't do if you're trying to write a romance novel. So that's one example. But anyway, I'm a big believer in that, and I genuinely believe, and experience has borne out, that without constraints you can't create anything. You're going to be in a sterile space. So what I typically do with students is I get them to work on extremely specific focused projects. And it could be something like, your piece can't be longer than 30 seconds. Or, you know, you're only allowed to use 8 notes. You know, really ridiculous constraints like this. There are so many artists in the 20th century that have shown us what you can do with even the most absurd set of constraints. Robert Rhine, the painter, who only made white paintings for his entire career. It's like, well, what can you do if all you're doing is making white paintings? What are the variables there? What are the parameters you're working with? How far can you stretch them? How far can your inventiveness go when the only color, the only pigment you're working with is white?
Are there any one-note compositions?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
The Italian
dynamics and.
Well, I can think of a few examples. There's Lamont Young, American minimalist composer, who wrote pieces that could go on for hours, where it would be centered around the resonance from a single note or a single interval. There's also an American minimalist composer who's still alive called Phil Niblock, Niblock, who does extraordinary acoustic installations based on sound sources that might not evolve at all over the course of a very long time. But probably the most famous example is Giacinto Scelsi, the Italian composer, who famously wrote a series of orchestral pieces based on a single note. And Quattro Pezzi, and it's called. So the point being that when you only have a single note, you have to pay attention to the other parameters and what you can do with the remaining parameters, right? So, okay, you only have a single pitch, but you still have timbre, you still have rhythm.
So an infinite number of instruments.
Right, exactly. You still have duration. You still have spatiality. You still have all of these other things to work with. And you need to make those other parameters work much harder in order to keep the piece going, because you've taken one of the parameters out of the equation. But you can do that. It's a test of your inventiveness.
Yeah, but you don't need to sell constraint to me.
No.
I'm in. One last thing I wanted to talk about is the importance, again, variety, the importance of having a varied practice. You've found success with your YouTube channel. I mean, I imagine in some ways that feeds into your creative practice. You perhaps gain more listeners as a result of this. Do you see it as all part of the same thing? Or are these very distinct things, the podcast, the YouTube channel, your composition, your teaching? Is it just one multifaceted project, or are they distinct projects?
No, it's all one project. It's all one project, and they feed into each other. And I tend not to allocate very much time to things that don't somehow relate to that ultimate project that I've been working on for my whole life. So if it's only tangentially related to it, if it's not strongly enough integrated into that goal or that pursuit, I just don't spend much time on those things. The YouTube channel is an interesting one because it generates a viewership that is significant now, not on the scale of, how far a YouTube channel can go, because there are YouTube channels with tens of millions of subscribers. I'm nowhere near that level. But nevertheless, it's resulted in a viewership that is significant and that I would not have had otherwise, certainly not on the same scale. And those people buy my CDs, they listen to my music, and they send me interesting questions, and they also support me financially because I have a Patreon account set up that allows people who choose to support the work that I'm doing, and in exchange for that, they get whatever I'm offering for a particular level of support. books or CDs or conversations, those sorts of things. So that in turn has resulted in greater financial stability for me, which has then allowed me to have more time to do my composing, and has also broadened my audience. So yes, the YouTube channel takes time, but it's also opened up time for me in a way that few other things I think could have done in the same way. And a further level to it is that when I make a YouTube video, generally what I'm doing is I'm analyzing pieces that I'm curious about or interested in as a composer. And I'm trying to present them in a way that will be accessible to the broadest number of people. So in order to present difficult concepts to large numbers of people, you really have to understand them very, very, very well in order to be able to do that. And that forces me to investigate those topics in tremendous depth, which is time consuming. But I get a lot out of that, because not only do I get the benefits of having a video go out and having thousands of people watch it, but I also get the benefit of increasing my own store of knowledge and my own range of skills. And that feeds into my practice as a composer. So it's beneficial on every level. And I like to think also that it benefits the people who are watching them, at least some of them, some of the time. That seems like a good thing. I'm tremendously fortunate to have the possibility of doing that. And I try to set up all of my projects so that they are beneficial on multiple levels at the same time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. So, is there anything you're doing that you want to plug?
Well, I think the easiest thing is for people to just check out my podcast, the Samuel Andreyev Podcast, which is available on all the major platforms for podcasts. So that's easy to find. Or my YouTube channel, Samuel Andreyev. Just type that into YouTube. It's Andreyev. And, if you want, you can also check out my CDs. There's links to that on the on both the podcast and the YouTube channel. I also have a website, which is www.samuelandreyev.com, all one word. And that's about it. You can find all the necessary links in those different sources if you want to look at what I'm doing a little bit more deeply.
Okay, so thank you for coming back to the podcast, and this isn't the last time, I'm sure.
It's always really good to talk to you, and I deeply appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much.
To discover more, visit us at penteractpress.com.